big leap in technology has arrived.
The first three-dimensional stereo immersive 32-bit video games.
Someone will inherit a fortune, but everyone's dying to bump you off.
Remember those 1990s items that seemed like the next big thing, until they totally failed? Back then, these products filled our homes, lunchboxes, and TV screens, shaping how we lived, played, and fit in. But looking back now, were we chasing progress or just buying into the hype? Crystal Pepsi was a drink that made you do a double take, and not in a good way. It was clear, it was fizzy, and it had Pepsi's name slapped right on the bottle. But once you took a sip, it was like someone had taken all the fun out of soda. It looked like water but tasted like confusion. Launched in the early 1990s, it was supposed to represent purity and innovation, a bold rebranding in the age of grunge music and frosted tips. The commercials were flashy. The promise was change. But America was not asking for change. People were loyal to their sugar, their brown bubbles, and their tradition. This was soda that tried too hard to be deep. Instead, it just tasted like a flat cola with a clean conscience. It disappeared almost as fast as it arrived, leaving behind confused customers and some seriously weird aftertaste memories. Even today, Crystal Pepsi is more of a punchline than a product. There are nostalgia-driven re-releases every few years, but they only prove what we already know. Some ideas are better off as memories. Crystal Pepsi tried to be the future, but it ended up being a flavor no one wanted to remember. Virtual Boy from Nintendo was not just a flop. It was a headache in a box. No, really, that is not a metaphor. This red and black 3D console was supposed to be the next big thing, a revolutionary gaming system that would transport players to other dimensions. What it did instead was give them eye strain, migraines, and a whole new reason to put the controller down. Released in 1995, Virtual Boy was Nintendo's first stab at virtual reality, and it missed the mark by a mile. The graphics were monochrome red, the headset was heavy, the gameplay was awkward, and the entire thing looked like laboratory equipment from a failed science fair. Even the most loyal Nintendo fans were baffled. There was no portability, the battery life was terrible, and you had to hunch over like a gargoyle just to play. The system launched with barely a dozen games and disappeared almost immediately from store shelves. For a company known for its magic touch, this was a rare misstep that everyone wanted to forget. But here is the thing, some people still remember it fondly. Not because it was good, but because it tried. And sometimes, trying too hard is its own kind of failure. Microsoft. Bob was what happened when you tried to make your computer feel like a cartoon, but it just made everything worse. Launched in 1995, this was supposed to be the future of user-friendly software. But instead of helping people navigate their desktops, Bob gave them a talking dog named Rover and a fake house full of clip art furniture. It looked more like a bad Saturday morning cartoon than a productivity tool. And that is not even the worst part. It was slow. It required way more computing power than most homes had at the time. And users? They were lost in the clutter. The interface was confusing, not comforting. What should have been a gentle handhold into the digital world felt more like an insult to your intelligence. Even Bill Gates has joked about it since. Microsoft pulled the plug fast, but not before the damage was done. Bob became a meme before memes were even a thing. It is remembered not for helping anyone, but for proving that even tech giants can have a cringe phase. And that talking dog? He made a comeback as the search assistant in early versions of Windows. But let's be honest, he was no smarter the second time around. Snackwells fat-free cookies were America's favorite lie in the 1990s. If you were alive during that time, chances are you ate a whole box and felt good about it. After all, they were fat-free, right? That meant healthy, right? Wrong. Snackwells tapped into the low-fat craze that swept through kitchens and grocery aisles like a health-conscious tornado, but what they left out in fat, they made up for in sugar. A lot of sugar. People thought they were snacking smarter, but they were just trading one problem for another. These cookies were soft, gooey, and dangerously addictive. And because the label said fat-free, people ate them like vegetables. It was snack marketing genius and a nutritional disaster. Eventually, the truth came out. Health experts rang the alarms. The public caught on. Sales plummeted. And Snackwells went from a pantry must-have to a cautionary tale. The green box is still around in some form, but the original craze? That is long gone. It was a sweet illusion, built on the back of a health trend that never really made sense. But for a few short years, those cookies made America feel better about making the same old mistakes. Orbit soda looked like someone bottled up a lava lamp and decided to call it a drink. Released in the late 1990s, it was a clear, fruit-flavored beverage filled with floating gelatin balls. Yes, balls. Just sitting there, suspended like alien eggs. The drink did not need shaking. In fact, it told you not to. But every sip felt like a dare. It was supposed to be fun. It was supposed to be futuristic. Instead, it was just weird. Orbits came in bright bottles with science fiction-style fonts and flavor names like vanilla orange and pineapple banana cherry coconut. But it did not matter what flavor you picked. They all tasted like cough syrup, with texture. This drink was not refreshing. It was an experience, and not a good one. It barely lasted a year in stores before quietly vanishing from shelves, never to be spoken of again, except by those brave enough to remember it. Every decade has its strange food experiments, but Orbits might be one of the strangest. It tried to be ahead of its time, but all it did was leave people asking, why? New Coke 2, also known as Coca-Cola Okay, was a sequel that absolutely nobody asked for. After the infamous failure of New Coke in the 1980s, you would think Coca-Cola would have learned their lesson. But in the 1990s, they gave it another shot, convinced that a rebrand could make lightning strike twice. It did not. Coca-Cola Okay was basically regular Coke with a slightly different formula, but it was packaged like a marketing intern's fever dream. The branding felt forced, the commercials were forgettable, and consumers? They were not impressed. It was less about flavor and more about confusion. Coca-Cola fans had already been through the emotional roller coaster of New Coke once. They were not about to be fooled again. And so, Coca-Cola Okay became the soda aisle equivalent of a shrug. It came, it went, and almost no one noticed. Looking back, it feels like the kind of product that only exists so people can say, wait, was that real? The answer is yes. It was real, and it was a real failure. Reebok Pump shoes made you feel like a superhero until you realized the pump did almost nothing. Released with wild hype in the early 1990s, these sneakers came with an inflatable pouch that let you pump up the tongue of your shoe for a customized fit. At least, that was the promise. What you actually got was a pair of sneakers that cost way too much and made you feel cool for about 5 minutes. Every kid wanted them. Every parent hesitated at the price tag. The commercials were loud, bold, and full of slam dunks. But on the playground, they were just another pair of shoes. The pump was more of a gimmick than a game changer. It gave the illusion of high-tech gear, but really it was just a plastic bubble that deflated your expectations. The hype wore off fast, and Reebok never quite recovered the same magic. Today, they live on as a nostalgic relic, worn ironically or remembered with a smirk. Because let's face it, if your shoes need air to work, maybe it is not the shoes that need fixing. HarleyDavidson Perfume was the brand extension absolutely no one saw coming, and for good reason. In the 1990s, someone at Harley-Davidson decided to bottle up the spirit of the open road and turn it into a fragrance. The result? A line of perfumes and colognes that smelled less like leather and motor oil and more like a boardroom trying way too hard. It was an awkward mashup of tough guy branding and department store sensibility. Imagine walking into a motorcycle dealership and walking out with a floral-scented gift set. The core Harley audience, the rugged, rebellious riders, wanted horsepower, not heart notes. And the people who actually bought perfume? They were not looking for something wrapped in chrome and faux grit. Sales tanked, fast. It was a branding misfire that taught everyone a lesson. Not every lifestyle can be bottled. The fragrance faded quickly from shelves and memory, leaving behind one important reminder. Just because you can sell something does not mean you should. The Apple Newton was not just a failure, it was an expensive one. Released in the early 1990s, the Newton was Apple's first attempt at a personal digital assistant. It had handwriting recognition, built-in apps, and looked like something out of a sci-fi movie. There was only one problem. It barely worked. The handwriting recognition was spotty at best. The software was buggy. And the price tag? Astronomical. Most people had no idea why they needed it. The Newton was trying to invent a future that just was not ready yet. In theory, it was groundbreaking. In practice, it was frustrating. Even though it was discontinued in under a decade, the Newton did lay the groundwork for later Apple devices. So while it failed hard, it failed forward. Still, for anyone who owned one back then, it was a pricey reminder that being first does not always mean being best. Zema was what happened when beer tried to reinvent itself as a trendy 1990s fashion statement. It was a clear, citrusy malt beverage that was neither beer nor soda, but something in between. Released in 1993, it was marketed as a refreshing alternative for people who wanted to drink something light and hip, but instead of looking cool, you just looked confused. The taste was odd, the branding was all over the place, and despite its slick advertising and futuristic vibe, Zema never really found an audience. It was too sweet for beer drinkers, too weird for soda fans, and too different to stick around. Bars stopped stocking it, friends stopped asking for it, and before long, Zema was gone. It made a few nostalgic comebacks in limited releases, but by then it had already become a cultural joke, a drink from the past that felt like it belonged to no one. Zema tried to be the next big thing and ended up being the punchline at the party. The Beanie Baby trading market was not just a fad. It was a full-blown cultural fever. Kids were hooked, parents were obsessed, and collectors? They were convinced they had struck gold. These soft, wide-eyed plush toys felt like limited edition lottery tickets in stuffed animal form. Prices skyrocketed. People were keeping them in plastic cases, refusing to let their children play with them. For a while, it really did feel like Beanie Babies were going to fund college tuition. But by the late 1990s, the bubble burst. The market collapsed under its own weight. The internet made it clear supply was not nearly as limited as people believed. What was once worth hundreds of dollars now barely fetched $5 at garage sales. The dream was over, and for many it ended in disappointment and storage bins packed with regret. Beanie Babies were a lesson in hype, herd mentality, and the danger of thinking toys are an investment strategy. They were cute, sure, but they were not gold. And once the magic wore off, they became a soft, cuddly reminder that not everything rare is valuable. Tamagotchi was the original digital pet, and for a while it ruled recess. But then came the spin-offs, the Gigapets, Nano Babies, and every other pixelated creature someone tried to hatch on a keychain. These knockoffs flooded the market fast, and they fizzled out even faster. Every company wanted a piece of the virtual pet craze, but few could capture the charm and chaos of the original. Some pets were too needy, others barely moved. The graphics got worse, the batteries died quicker, and in most cases, the novelty wore off before the batteries even ran out. Kids who begged for one lost interest by the weekend. The market got saturated, and with every new release, the magic thinned out. What started as a digital revolution turned into background noise. Parents were not fooled. Teachers banned them from classrooms. And before long, Gigapets and their spin-off friends were stuffed in drawers, replaced by newer, shinier distractions. Tamagotchi may still have a nostalgic pulse, but its clones are long forgotten. Sometimes imitation is not flattery. It is just a shortcut to failure. Barbie fashion designer CDROM sounded like a dream until you actually booted it up. In theory, it was supposed to let kids design outfits for Barbie, print them, and even dress up their dolls in real fabric. It promised creativity and interactivity. But what you got instead was clunky graphics, laggy controls, and a user interface that felt like it was designed in 5 minutes. It was slow, it was limited, and for a product tied to one of the most iconic brands in the world, it was shockingly underwhelming. The software ran on early home computers, which meant crashing was common and patience was mandatory. The actual gameplay? Repetitive. You picked colors, you clicked patterns, and then you waited forever to print something that barely stuck together. It looked glamorous on the box, but played like a PowerPoint presentation. For many kids, this was their first experience with disappointment in the digital age. Barbie deserved better, so did the players. Instead of sparking imagination, it just kind of sat there, slow, awkward, and way less fun than just using your own scissors and glitter. The Philips CDI tried to be everything: gaming console, movie player, educational tool, but ended up being nothing. It came out at a time when people were still figuring out what multimedia even meant. And Philips thought they had the answer. The CDI was meant to play games, videos, music, and even interactive encyclopedias. But the problem? None of it was good. The games were clunky, the movies looked terrible, and worst of all, the controls felt like they were built for a completely different species. It got most of its attention for licensing Nintendo characters like Mario and Link, except those games were so bad they became infamous. The Legend of Zelda on CDI is still used as a punchline by gamers everywhere. Instead of being ahead of its time, the CDI was out of sync with reality. Too expensive, too confusing, and too slow for the average user. It was a system nobody asked for and even fewer people bought. If technology is supposed to make life easier, the CDI was a masterclass in doing the exact opposite. Koogie sweaters were loud, bright, colorful, and for a moment they were everything. Made famous by hip-hop legends like the Notorious B.I.G., these kaleidoscopic knit sweaters became a status symbol in the early 1990s. You could not miss them. They were like walking pieces of abstract art, and for a short while, they were everywhere: magazines, music videos, and album covers. But the fad burned hot and fast. The patterns were bold, but hard to wear. Fashion trends moved on. And pretty soon, what was once fresh started to feel like overkill. By the late 1990s, Koogie sweaters had disappeared from closets and street corners, replaced by sleeker, more minimalist styles. The brand tried to make comebacks, but the magic never returned. Maybe it was too much color? Maybe it was the wrong time? Or maybe Koogie was just one of those things that was always destined to be a snapshot of one specific moment in fashion history. Either way, it left as loudly as it arrived. The Bell Beefer was Taco Bell's take on a Sloppy Joe, but with taco meat. If that sounds odd, that is because it was. In the early 1990s, Taco Bell tried to repurpose their taco filling into a sandwich format, thinking customers would eat it up. They did not. It was ground beef on a hamburger bun with lettuce and sauce. It looked like fast food déjà vu. It confused people. Taco Bell was supposed to be tacos, burritos, maybe a quesadilla if you were feeling bold. A beef sandwich? That just felt off-brand. And when something feels off-brand in fast food, it gets pulled fast. Most people never even saw it on the menu. And those who did were not exactly asking for seconds. In the end, the Bell Beefer became a quirky footnote in fast food history, a sandwich born of experimentation and buried by indifference. Because sometimes the line between tacos and burgers should not be crossed. All Sport Body Quencher was supposed to be the cooler, more intense cousin to Gatorade. It had bold colors, it had big flavors, and it had branding that screamed athlete. But what it did not have was staying power. The drink was sugary, a little too sweet for people actually trying to rehydrate. And even though it tried to carve out a space in the sports drink world, it always felt like it was playing catch-up. The packaging looked like something from a comic book. The commercials tried too hard, and the product itself? It was just okay. For athletes, it was not functional enough. For casual drinkers, it was too intense. It sat awkwardly in the middle, not quite knowing who it was for. By the late 1990s, it was off most store shelves. replaced by brands that understood hydration and branding a little better. All sport tried to make water look extreme, but in the end, it just made a lot of people reach for something else. Mortal Kombat was one of the edgiest video games of the 1990s. Bloody, brutal, and unapologetically intense. So naturally, someone thought it would make great children's toys. The action figures hit store shelves in the mid-1990s and they looked cool enough. But something did not sit right. The source material was an arcade fighting game famous for ripping out spines and turning people into skeletons. And now here it was, rebranded for 8-year-olds. Parents were confused. Retailers were hesitant. And kids? They liked the games, but the toys just felt off. They did not do much, no blood, no action, just plastic versions of violent characters without the violence that made them famous. The mismatch was obvious. Mortal Kombat was built on controversy. These toys tried to smooth that over, and in doing so, they lost what made the brand iconic. Sales lagged. The toy line quietly vanished, and everyone moved on, wondering why anyone thought it was a good idea in the first place. The real Beverly Hills 90210 board game was the kind of thing you bought on impulse, played once, and never spoke of again. Based on the hit teen drama, the game tried to turn television drama into a night of family fun. But fun is not the word most people would use. The gameplay was slow, the mechanics were clunky, and the goal? Vaguely defined. You collected cool points, avoided drama, and tried to win popularity contests. In theory, it captured the high school chaos of the show. In practice, it was boring. Even fans of the series struggled to get through a full round. The trivia questions were bland, the challenges made no sense, and the whole thing felt like it was made by someone who had never actually watched the show. It was a classic case of cashing in on a trend without putting in the effort. The board game disappeared quickly, and today it exists mostly as a collector's joke or ironic thrift store find. A relic of a time when slapping a brand on a box was enough to sell a game, if only for a little while. Laserdisc was supposed to be the future of home video, but it never made it past the early adopters. Introduced with better picture and sound quality than VHS, it looked like the next big thing. But one look at the size of the disc and people started to rethink. These things were huge, about the size of a vinyl record, and unlike VHS tapes, you could not record on them. They were also shockingly delicate, and even the smallest scratch could turn your movie night into a silent slideshow. Retailers tried to talk up the superior experience, but most customers were too busy asking where the rewind button was. Hollywood released some titles on Laserdisc, but only cinephiles and collectors really cared. The general public looked at the price tag and saw a giant frisbee that cost more than a microwave. It was sleek, it was shiny, and it made you feel high-tech, right up until you tried to use it. Plus, they were expensive. Really expensive. You needed special players. The discs were fragile, and most movies came on multiple discs, which meant flipping or swapping halfway through. That might sound fine for a collector, but for a tired parent on movie night, not so much. VHS won because it was simple, durable, and cheap. Laserdisc lost because it forgot what people actually wanted: convenience. Eventually, DVD would do what Laserdisc could not: offer quality without the headaches. And just like that, Laserdisc became an impressive-looking, completely impractical failure. Betamax was already on life support by the time the 1990s rolled around, but Sony just could not let it go. In a last-ditch effort, they tried to revive the format in the late 1990s with new machines and updated tapes, hoping that nostalgia or a second wind in the professional market would carry it through. Spoiler alert, it did not. VHS had already won the format war in the 1980s. DVD was stepping in by the late 1990s to take everything digital. Sony pushed the narrative that Betamax was technically better, but nobody cared by then. Customers just wanted something they could find at any store, not a specialist tool that cost more and did less. Rental stores phased Betamax out so quickly that you would be lucky to find a dusty copy of a workout video. Even camcorder manufacturers quietly walked away, choosing formats that people actually owned. The revival felt like a stubborn sequel to a movie no one had asked for. And here was Betamax trying to act like it still had something to offer. The tapes were smaller and technically sharper, but none of that mattered anymore. People had moved on. Rental stores had moved on. Even the camcorder market that once favored Betamax was now looking toward mini DVDs and digital formats. Sony marketed it as professional grade, but the public was not buying that line anymore, literally or figuratively. It was like trying to sell cassette tapes in the age of iPods. The revival failed almost instantly. Production stopped, and what was once a high-tech badge of honor became a footnote. Betamax had been ahead of its time when it launched, but by the 1990s, it was just out of time. And sometimes knowing when to quit is the most professional thing you can do. The TV VCR Combo seemed like a genius idea at first. One device, fewer cords, fewer headaches. In the 1990s, space-saving technology felt like the future, and the idea of combining your television and video cassette recorder into one compact unit was a dream. But then reality hit. If the VCR broke, the whole unit had to go in for repair. If the TV screen failed, your tapes were stuck inside. And because they were often cheaply made to cut costs, things broke more often than anyone wanted to admit. They were infamous for eating tapes, freezing screens, and suddenly refusing to turn back on. The remote controls were overloaded with confusing buttons that seemed like they belonged to neither the TV nor the VCR. Trying to set the clock felt like solving a puzzle created by someone who hated you. Manufacturers knew the combo units were flawed, but they kept making them because they looked modern. And for a while, looking modern was all it took to get people to buy in. They were also bulky, oddly shaped, and difficult to mount or fit in entertainment centers. Add in the rapid rise of DVDs and the beginning of DVR technology, and these combos went from innovative to obsolete in record time. People did not want one device to do two things badly. They wanted two great devices that worked. And as flat-screen televisions became more affordable, the combo units started gathering dust in spare rooms, pawn shops, and garage sales. By the early 2000s, they had gone from futuristic to forgotten. The idea was clever, sure, but the execution was a little too early and a lot too fragile. A solution that just created more problems. As the calendar inched closer to the year 2000, the world briefly lost its mind. Y2K panic was everywhere. Computer crashes, blackout predictions, even planes falling from the sky. And where there is fear, there is money to be made. Enter Millennium Dome Y2K gear. Emergency kits, freeze-dried food, hand-crank radios, battery-powered water purifiers, booklets explaining how to restart your entire life if society collapsed on New Year's Day. Entire store aisles were turned into Y2K panic zones, and you could buy an end-of-the-world kit with a smile. Companies that had never touched survival gear were suddenly slapping Y2K stickers on everything from flashlights to cereal. There were even Y2K-branded hats, t-shirts, and keychains, because nothing says disaster prep like merch. The Millennium Dome itself was supposed to be a celebration, but it quickly became a weird mix of optimism and low-key dread. When nothing happened, people felt relief, but also a weird kind of embarrassment about all the money they had spent. It was not just survivalist corners buying in. Normal families were clearing out grocery store shelves. People bought Y2K insurance policies. Schools held seminars. Tech companies rolled out patches like they were selling life preservers on a sinking ship. The dome itself, a flashy monument in London, was meant to celebrate human achievement. But all the gear inside it? That felt more like a countdown to chaos. And then, nothing happened. The ball dropped. The clocks kept ticking. The world moved on, and people were left with bunkers full of canned beans and crank radios they would never use. The market for Y2K gear dried up overnight. The Millennium Dome became a punchline, and everything people bought in panic turned into clutter. It was a reminder that fear can sell anything, but only until reality steps in and turns the lights back on. In the late 1990s, Nike decades were just another pair of sneakers, clean black and white design, decent comfort, nothing too flashy. But in 1997, they became infamous for a reason no brand ever wants. The Heaven's Gate cult. 39 members wore matching Nike Decades when they died in a mass suicide, believing they were leaving their bodies behind to reach an alien spaceship. Their neatly lined up shoes became part of the crime scene. News cameras zoomed in. The name Nike was broadcast into millions of homes, attached to tragedy. For Nike, it was branding at its worst, unintentional, unstoppable, and unforgettable. The fact that the shoes were affordable and readily available only made it easier for the cult to adopt them. Nike quickly issued statements and shut down production, but the damage had already made its way into pop culture. The Decades were no longer sneakers, they were symbols. Collectors today might chase the rarity, but most people remember the eerie headlines and the heavy legacy. Sales of the Decades dropped instantly. Nike pulled them from stores. Any remaining stock was destroyed. The company wanted nothing to do with the association, even though they had not endorsed or collaborated with the group in any way. But the damage was done. A pair of sneakers had become a symbol of something horrific. In the world of branding, perception is everything, and once that image sticks, you cannot walk away from it. Today, Nike Decades are collector's items only because of the notoriety. But for Nike, the whole event was a public relations nightmare and a chilling example of how no product, no matter how well made, is immune to what people associate it with. The XFL was not just a football league, it was a spectacle, and it was born out of pure 1990s excess. Created by World Wrestling Federation boss Vince McMahon, the XFL promised to take football, strip out the boring parts, and turn it into an extreme entertainment event. There were no fair catches. Players had nicknames on their jerseys. Cameras followed them into locker rooms. Cheerleaders were treated more like performers than athletes. And the rules? Looser, rougher, all flash. The first game drew millions of viewers, curious, maybe even hopeful, that this could be something real. But those viewers did not come back for week 2. The games lacked polish, the teams lacked chemistry, and everything felt like it was trying too hard. Half the time, it looked more like a scripted reality show than a sporting event. Even players looked unsure if they were in a league or an audition. Behind the scenes, networks were nervous, and advertisers started disappearing. But that hope disappeared fast. The gameplay was sloppy. The commentary was cringeworthy. And the extreme part started feeling like a cover for just bad football. Ratings tanked, sponsors pulled out, players complained, and after just one season in 2001, the league folded. The hype machine had exploded on launch, but had no fuel to keep going. What was supposed to challenge the NFL ended up being a cautionary tale in branding over substance. People wanted football, not a wrestling storyline with helmets. The XFL did try to return twice after that, but it was born out of the late 1990s, and that is exactly where it belongs. Cigarette ads on television in the 1970s were less like commercials and more like Hollywood trailers. A smooth-talking cowboy rode into the sunset, puffing away like it was the secret to happiness. Doctors in lab coats said smoking was fine. Cartoon camels winked at kids between Saturday morning shows. These weren't just ads, they were cultural icons. Brands like Winston, Marlboro, and Lucky Strike had jingles stuck in your head longer than the smoke in your hair. Primetime slots weren't reserved for family programming. They were for soft jazz, rugged men, and slow-motion exhales. Cigarette companies didn't just sell tobacco. They sold cool. They sold freedom. And they did it straight into American living rooms during dinner. By 1971, the U.S. government finally banned these ads from TV and radio, recognizing how deeply they influenced public health. But the damage was already done. An entire generation had grown up believing a smoke break was glamorous. And just like the airwaves, the very air we breathed indoors was often saturated with danger, from sources a lot less obvious than a cigarette. There was a time when TWWA meant elegance, a time when stepping onto a Trans-World Airlines flight was like entering a luxury hotel in the sky. The seats were wide, the service crisp, the logo iconic. From movie stars to newlyweds, Everyone wanted to fly TWA. It was part of the golden age of air travel. But by the 1970s, the clouds were darkening. Deregulation hit hard. New competitors raced into the skies, offering faster routes and cheaper fares. Fuel prices soared, labor disputes dragged on, and TWA's once glorious reputation began to buckle. What once felt like flying with royalty now felt outdated and expensive. Suddenly, the airline of tomorrow had become yesterday's news. It expanded too quickly, bought too many jets, and could not keep up with the ruthless economics of modern air travel. Bankruptcy became a familiar word. By the time American Airlines absorbed what remained in the early 2000s, the brand was already a shadow. Airports removed the signs, crews traded uniforms, but the memory lingered. For anyone who flew TWA during its heyday, there was nothing like it. Now, it is a name buried under decades of debt and nostalgia, a ghost with wings. Parker's is the second oldest name on this list by far. I mean, compared to the rest of the names on here, this is certifiably ancient. It was made in 1855 inside the Omni Parker House Hotel in Boston, which on its own is a pretty recognizable part of American history. It's one of America's oldest operating hotel restaurants, and the fact that it survived literally a century and more to tell its tale should let you know how successful this place really was. It was even the birthplace of some iconic regional foods, like the Boston cream pie, which was a deliciously rich pie with a unique cream filling you couldn't get anywhere else. To top that off, it had its own dish with its namesake that caught the wallets and eyes of people everywhere, which was the Parker House roll. It became extremely beloved in New England, becoming a huge part of the cuisine there, and even presidents were known to have visited the Omni Parker House Hotel just for a taste of Parker's restaurant. It blended in American menu items with French influences, something that, at the time, nobody else was doing. It makes sense that presidents visited this place, since a lot of them, like Charles Dickens and John F. Kennedy, who were regular patrons, were big fans of French cuisine too. Long before music was digital, it spun on plastic. Record players with built-in speakers were the backbone of every teenager's room and every family living room. They were bulky, boxy, and usually brown or beige. But when you placed that needle on the groove, the room changed. You might remember hearing the Jackson 5, the Carpenters, or Fleetwood Mac for the very first time through one of these machines. The sound was warm, slightly fuzzy, and crackled at the edges, but it was alive. Kids would stack their 45s, adjust the tone arm, and lower the needle with care. These were not sleek devices. They were furniture. Some had lids that closed like a suitcase. Others had knobs you had to gently coax into the right spot. Volume? Not much. But intimacy? All the way. You sat close to it. You knew every skip and scratch on your favorite record. You could play the same song 10 times in a row and it felt new every time. It was not about convenience, it was about connection. The record player was not background noise, it was the centerpiece of your downtime. Hearing one today might just make you stop, listen, and remember who you were when that song first played. Sunbathing with baby oil and reflectors was the ultimate summer ritual. You lay out in the backyard, on the roof, or at the beach, armed with nothing but a bottle of Johnson's baby oil and a silver reflector under your chin. The goal? Tan fast, tan deep, and tan dark. The shine from the oil made your skin sizzle, and the reflector bounced rays straight into your face like a heat lamp. Everyone did it. Magazines encouraged it. Tan lines were a badge of honor, peeling skin a minor inconvenience. Sunscreen, if it was used at all, was barely SPF 4. People believed a good tan was healthy. Doctors warned of sunburn, but nobody listened. Today, dermatologists beg patients to stop tanning, and laws limit tanning bed access for minors. The link between ultraviolet exposure and skin cancer is undeniable. But back then, summer meant bronze skin and beach bodies, no matter the cost. Sunburns turned into tans, blisters were shrugged off, and if the oil left you red and raw, you did it again the next day. The danger came slowly. Just like another invisible risk, many families kept right next to the medicine cabinet, in a tiny glass stick filled with mercury. Ginos Hamburgers was a mid-Atlantic icon. With its bold red signs and sports tie-ins, it stood out in a crowded fast food landscape. Kids loved the burgers, adults loved the prices, and everybody loved the connection to football legend Gino Marchetti, who co-founded the chain after retiring from the NFL. It was fast, friendly, and local. In cities like Baltimore and Philadelphia, it was as common as traffic. But Ginos had ambitions beyond the region. It wanted to go national. What felt like a hometown treasure did not always translate outside the neighborhood. The farther it spread, the more it lost the charm that made it matter. The problem was the rest of the country already had their go-to burger joints: McDonald's, Burger King, Wendy's. Ginos tried to differentiate. It added Kentucky Fried Chicken to its menu through a partnership. It redesigned stores. But growth was slow. The charm that worked in Baltimore did not translate in California. By the 1980s, Marriott had bought the chain and converted most of the locations into Roy Rogers. Just like that, Ginos was gone. The buildings changed, the signs came down, and a local legend faded into memory. But for those who grew up with it, Ginos was never just a burger. It was home. Formaldehyde in foam insulation and furniture was the invisible guest in every camper van, basement rec room, and mid-century couch. You could smell it in the musty air of grandma's guest bedroom, or the slightly sharp scent inside every mobile home. That chemical wasn't just floating around, it was baked into the foam of seat cushions, the glue holding together your faux wood paneling, and the insulation packed behind the walls. It was cheap, effective, and everywhere. But it also off-gassed like a slow leak, seeping into your lungs while you watched television or napped on a vinyl recliner. Exposure caused watery eyes, skin rashes, sore throats, and, in prolonged cases, respiratory issues and even cancer. The furniture looked modern and sleek, but the air inside many homes became a ticking time bomb. Some people chalked it up to new couch smell and thought nothing of it. But formaldehyde didn't care about aesthetics. The government didn't start cracking down until health complaints poured in from mobile home parks and campers where levels spiked through the roof. And even then, warnings were vague. Back then, though, it was just that smell people got used to. And if your living room wasn't fuming, your scalp might have been, especially if you were chasing those pin-straight 70s hair goals. Remember that place I said White Tower copied and got into some franchising issues with? Well, meet the very first to do it, White Castle. First founded in 1921 in Wichita, Kansas, by two men, Billy Ingram and Walter Anderson, White Castle was an innovator, and I don't think there was ever a more appropriate use of the word in this entire list. It was known as the first fast food hamburger chain in the United States, period. It also came up with small, square burgers instead of what we typically are used to, and these would later on be called sliders in today's day and age. White Castle wasn't just known for its White Castle-like architecture, which became a huge crux of its branding. It was also known for its really unique method of preparation. The burgers were made with onions and had holes in the patties, and this ensured that the patty was made evenly. The chain was one of the first fast food joints to have standardized food preparation and assembly line techniques, as well as an impeccable standard for hygiene. All in all, it was everything that fast food places today aren't, but a lot of places tried to follow its example back then because this place set the template of fast, convenient, clean, and easy food. White Castle became known for efficiency, simplicity, and a lot of good food. Pop beads were not just a craft, they were a lifestyle. These chunky, colorful plastic beads snapped together with a satisfying click, turning into necklaces, bracelets, tiaras, or anything else your imagination dreamed up. Every little girl had a box of them. Every slumber party included at least one fashion show. But pop beads were more than accessories. They were building blocks. They were puzzles. They were surprisingly strong and endlessly versatile. You could pull them apart to start over or wear your creation all day like it was made of gold. They came in every color of the rainbow. Some were clear, some were glittery, some looked like tiny candies. And yes, sometimes you chewed on them even though you were not supposed to. Sometimes they turned into weapons, flicked across the room or used to bind your younger sibling. That was half the fun. Pop beads were part toy, part rebellion. They made you feel creative, independent, grown up even, until one popped off and vanished under the couch, never to be seen again. You always lost one, but the set never felt incomplete. You just made a shorter necklace. Pop beads were a rite of passage in childhood. Bright, noisy, and totally unforgettable. Smoking was everywhere in the 1980s. Not just on sidewalks or street corners, but inside diners, airplanes, grocery stores, even hospitals. Ashtrays were bolted to fast food tables. The clink of ice in a glass mixed with the flick of a lighter. Office meetings were held through a fog of cigarette smoke. Passengers lit up at 30,000 feet in a sealed cabin, and nobody said a word. There were smoking sections in restaurants, but no real barriers. Just a vague separation by aisle or air vent. It was part of the scenery, part of the culture. But today, smoking indoors is banned in most public spaces across the United States. What once symbolized adulthood now reads as a health hazard. But at the time, it was just background noise, something that hung in the curtains and clung to your coat. And if the air in those spaces was thick with smoke, it was also filled with something else that seems almost unbelievable now: medicine sold without oversight. Mercury thermometers were in every medicine cabinet, usually tucked behind a box of cotton balls or a half-used bottle of rubbing alcohol. They looked like tiny magic wands, glass, delicate, and filled with shimmering silver liquid. Getting your temperature taken meant shaking it down like a maraca, then holding it under your tongue without accidentally biting it in half. But if one broke, no big deal. You'd gather up the scattered beads of mercury with a paper towel or chase them across the bathroom floor for fun. The liquid rolled like little metal marbles and seemed totally harmless. It was even mesmerizing, but that shiny stuff is toxic. Breathing in mercury vapor, especially in small enclosed rooms, can damage your lungs, brain, and kidneys. And yet, in the 1970s, nobody worried. Pediatricians used them daily. Schools had them on hand. And the warnings? Barely a whisper. Once digital thermometers became cheaper and more reliable, the mercury version faded away. Today, even the tiniest spill triggers a full hazmat response. But back then, it was just another part of being sick. And if you were sick at home in the 70s, chances are you were surrounded by something just as colorful and even more dangerous. Record Bar was not just a store, it was a ritual. A place where teenagers went to spend their last few dollars on a cassette, where college students flipped through vinyl with purpose, and where parents hunted for the next hit their kids could play too loud. The smell of shrink wrap, the sound of headphones clamped over your ears, that feeling of holding a new album like it was a treasure. In the 1970s and 1980s, Record Bar was in malls across America. It was part of the cultural fabric. But time moved on. Music got smaller. First the CD, then the download, and finally the invisible stream. Malls lost their sparkle, the ritual faded, and Record Bar, like so many others, folded under the weight of a world that no longer needed it. The music still plays, but the experience is gone. You can click a button now, but you will never get that feeling again. That quiet buzz of possibility as you stepped through the door. Red Barn was this fast food chain that ended up being known for its barn-shaped buildings, and in Ohio and Michigan, which had a massive concentration of chicken lovers given how well KFC is there, that was probably a great idea. Their menu also included a lot of what KFC's menu did, except they also had fish sandwiches. Red Barn was a local option that pioneered a lot of things in the fast food industry. It was one of the first fast food restaurants to even have a salad bar, and that was really rare for places like that back then. We might be used to them now, but the trend had to have started somewhere, and places like Red Barn definitely helped the idea get going. It also featured double-decker burgers and its iconic Barnbuster sandwich, which was so beloved by local communities in Ohio and Michigan and even other states that it gave titans like McDonald's and Burger King a run for their money. It had everything going for it: unique branding, an affordable menu with recognizable items but just enough new things to set it apart, and amazing quality, but it eventually ran into a lot of franchising issues and couldn't last. Though it did inspire a wave of more focus on architecture, just like White Tower did, because competitors took note how the barn-shaped buildings really helped pull in customers. The Viewmaster was not just a toy, it was a portal. You held it up to your face like binoculars, clicked the lever, and entered a new world, one tiny slide at a time. These were not just pictures. They were 3D windows into places you had never been and shows you loved. Suddenly, Bugs Bunny was popping out at you. You were walking through Disneyland or swimming under the sea. The images were bright, bold, and vivid, especially when the sunlight hit just right. The reels came in paper packets, labeled like treasure maps, each one promising a new adventure, and you kept them all, in shoe boxes, in drawers, maybe scattered across the floor until your mom made you pick them up. The Viewmaster made you feel like a traveler, even if you never left your room. It was quiet entertainment. No batteries, no wires, no screens. Just your imagination and a satisfying click with every slide. The joy was in the anticipation. What will the next picture be? Where will I go next? You could spend hours lost in it. You remember how your arms got tired, but you kept clicking. One more reel. One more journey. Because for those few minutes, the world was just you and the magic inside that plastic viewer. Hitchhiking was once seen as adventurous, not reckless. People stuck out their thumbs with a smile and a sign, hoping for a ride and maybe a story. Soldiers on leave, college students on break, wanderers with a dream, they all relied on the kindness of strangers. Roads were filled with possibilities, and nobody thought twice about pulling over. You might remember watching someone hop into a stranger's car and wave goodbye, trusting the road and the driver. It was how many got from one town to the next, especially before cheap bus fares and ride-sharing apps. Parents might warn you to be careful, but that was the extent of the worry. Hitchhiking was not illegal in most places. It was resourceful. Over time, though, stories of assaults, disappearances, and crimes changed the narrative. Laws tightened, signs went up, no hitchhiking. Now, in many states, it is restricted or outright banned. The open road closed itself off. Hitchhiking became a symbol of risk rather than freedom. But for those who once stuck out their thumb and caught a ride with a stranger, it still lives in memory as a gesture of trust. And just as strangers were trusted, so were quiet children waiting patiently in cars, alone. Glass baby bottles with rubber nipples were the parenting standard of the time. No fancy sterilizers, no microwave steam bags. Just a pot of boiling water on the stove, a handful of bottles, and a prayer you didn't melt the rubber or scald yourself. These bottles were sturdy, heavy, and dangerously slick when wet. The rubber nipples had a faint, plastic meets rubber scent that never quite left, no matter how many times you rinsed them. If one fell, it shattered. If you lost a nipple ring, good luck finding a replacement before dinner. But this was the norm. Parents spent a surprising amount of time tending to bottle paraphernalia like lab technicians. Eventually, plastic took over, but even that came with its own controversies: BPA, phthalates, and microplastics. Modern parents may have fewer shards to deal with, but also face new concerns. Back then, it was simple: glass, rubber, boil, repeat. But for all the risks inside the kitchen, some of the most dangerous moments happened in plain sight, on the sidewalk, in the yard, or right outside your front door. PanAmerican World Airways was not just a brand. It was a symbol, a ticket to the world stamped in blue and white, with flight attendants in crisp uniforms and ads that made the world seem smaller and more elegant. For much of the 20th century, flying Pan Am meant you had made it. But by the 1970s, the cracks were showing. Oil prices spiked, air travel deregulated, competition exploded, and Pan Am, bloated with international routes and expensive aircraft, could not adapt fast enough. It tried new services, rebranded its cabins, and even launched a short-lived domestic push. But nothing stuck. The glory days were gone, and the bills kept coming. By the early 1990s, it was over. Planes grounded, staff laid off, logos fading from airports and travel posters. For many Americans, Pan Am was their first flight, their first window seat, their first glimpse of the clouds from above. To watch it fall felt like watching the future turn to dust. It was more than a business loss. It was a goodbye to the golden age of travel. Burger Queen Druthers was also known for its mascot, Queenie Bee, and a really simple and affordable menu that was burgers, chicken, and milkshakes. You might be wondering why the name is split into two, though, and, well, they used to be known as Burger Queen, but they changed their name to Druthers eventually. It was an attempt to set itself apart, and it also worked with their new slogan in the 1980s, which was, "I'd rather go to Druthers." Yeah, I can safely say their shakes and burgers were worth your money, but that pun game really needs work. Anyway, they would eventually expand their menu far past items like basic burgers and would include fish sandwiches and fired chicken, which helped boost its popularity enough to give local fast food chains some competition. It unfortunately couldn't keep up with other competitors that were big enough to have a nationwide presence, and the constant attempts at refreshing its image meant that it lost a sense of identity, ironically enough. However, what it did show a lot of other businesses in America was the idea of expanding your menu to include more varied items. This is something places would try to adopt a lot because they saw how it helped Druthers keep up with local competition, so it became a go-to idea for startups and up-and-coming fast food joints. Playgrounds used to be a little more dangerous, and the metal slide on asphalt was the crown jewel of poor design. In the 1970s, nearly every school or park had one. It stood tall, often 2 stories high, baking in the sun until it could sear the back of your legs. No shade, no padding, just you, gravity, and a prayer. The steps up were made of thin metal bars. The top had no real guardrails, and when you slid down, you hit that blacktop like a dropped steak. But we lined up for it anyway, over and over. There was something thrilling about the danger. It was a rite of passage, a fast, hot, jolting ride that ended in a dusty scrape or bruised elbow. Teachers watched from afar. Parents shrugged. Kids were expected to bounce back. If you made it to the bottom without a scream, you earned bragging rights. If you got burned, you wore it like a badge. Safety standards have come a long way since then, but so much of that fearless, feral childhood play was tied to moments like these. Today, it is hard to believe we once thought that was normal, but deep down, part of us misses it. Letting kids ride standing up in the back seat was not just overlooked, it was often encouraged. The space between the 2 front seats was a coveted spot, a mini stage where children stood to give directions, tell stories, or just feel taller. It felt like driving without actually driving. Parents drove with one arm loosely draped over the passenger seat while a child stood between them, gripping the dashboard, peering out at the road like a co-pilot. In the back, kids slid across vinyl seats, bounced with each turn, or lay down and stared at the ceiling. There were no reminders to buckle up, because buckling up was not yet a rule. It was a nuisance. The seatbelt often stayed buried beneath the cushions or was jammed into the crack between the seats. Today, it is illegal for a child to ride without a proper car seat or restraint. Parents now face fines, or worse, for what was once everyday family travel. But back then, riding unrestrained was just another way to feel free. There was trust, or maybe just oblivion. Either way, it was the norm. And if today's laws would call that reckless, the next parenting habit would cause even more of an uproar. It took place in plain sight, often with a crowd watching. Toy guns that looked exactly like real ones were a staple of 1970s childhood. Kids ran through neighborhoods playing cops and robbers with replica revolvers that had metal frames, wood-style grips, and no orange safety tips. These toys didn't just mimic real guns. They practically were real guns without the ability to fire. Some had weight, some made realistic sounds, and others had loading chambers that looked straight out of a Western. Parents didn't think twice. They were just toys. But law enforcement often couldn't tell the difference. tragic misunderstandings occurred, and by the 1980s and 1990s, regulations stepped in to require safety markings and visual distinctions. Today's toy guns look neon and soft on purpose, but back then, authenticity was the goal. They were cool, they were dangerous, and they were everywhere. But they weren't the only everyday item hiding a global threat, because the next topic quite literally changed the atmosphere. If one of these 1990s flops hit a nerve, tell us in the comments, tap like and subscribe for more blasts from the past.